Martin West is the academic dean and Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, expert on the events and trends that influence and impact education across the country and at different age levels. The COVID-19 panic disrupted student learning and development and resulted in significant learning loss and an increase in mental health challenges. The average public school student, as you might well surmise, in grades 3 to 8, lost the equivalent of a half year of learning in math and a quarter year in reading. Mr. West is a co-author of the book Teachers versus the Public: What Americans Think About Schools and How to Fix Them. Let's find the answers to those questions from one of America's top educators, Martin West. Please welcome Mr. West. Welcome. Good to have you here, Martin. Thank you.
All right. Good morning. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Randy. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you today. So what I want to do over the next 20 minutes is share with you some new evidence on how U.S. students are faring academically in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, share some thoughts on how we might help them do better, and do both of those things while drawing on and making the case for the importance of something known as the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the nation's report card. This is, in my opinion, perhaps the most important activity undertaken by the United States Department of Education. And in an environment of uncertainty about federal research and development spending, as we started this morning's conversation, I think it behooves us to pay attention to its importance. This is a timely moment to be thinking about these questions of how students have recovered from learning loss associated with the pandemic. It was 5 years ago this week that schools, the 100,000 schools in the U.S. serving 50 million students, shut their doors first for 2 weeks to slow the spread of the virus, then for 2 or 3 months to close out the school year, and then in many regions of the countries on into the entirety of the subsequent 2021 school year. This is not a talk about the merits of those decisions. While that might be interesting to reflect on, my hope is that we'll never face that precise set of trade-offs with public health and youth well-being again in the future. Rather, this is the context in which we can ask and answer questions about how students are faring currently. And as I said, we're going to draw on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the NAEP, in order to do that. The NAEP is the only ongoing assessment program that is routinely administered to nationally representative samples of American students. So you have the college entrance exams from like the ACT and the SAT. Those tests are national in scope, but they're highly selected in terms of the population that participates, and that selection varies over time and from place to place. Then we have the standardized math and reading tests that states administer to all students attending public schools. The challenge with those is that they vary from one state to the next, making direct comparisons impossible. It is only the NAEP program that gives us a common yardstick that allows us to answer questions like, how are U.S. students as a whole doing academically? How do today's students compare to prior generations? And how much progress are specific groups of students making over time? The NAEP program is administered by the National Center on Education Statistics within the U.S. Department of Education. Its work is overseen, though, by what's known as the National Assessment Governing Board. This is a committee of 26 representatives of state and local education systems and governments. There's not a single federal official on the National Assessment Governing Board. It is comprised entirely of state and local representatives in order to ensure that the testing program, although funded with federal dollars, is aligned to state and local needs. Over the past 6 years, I've had the honor of being a member, and over the past 2 years, the vice chair of the National Assessment Governing Board. And it's thanks to the NAEP we first, about 2 years ago, learned about the devastating impact that COVID-19 and the associated school closures had on student learning. the headline from September 2022, noting that the pandemic erased 2 decades worth of progress in the core academic subjects of math and reading. And so earlier this year, we had a chance to look at what the data showed at the end of the 23-24 school year when the latest round of NAEP tests were administered. And in order to get you oriented to this picture, there'll be some like it. I'm going to first let you know that around 10 or so points on the NAEP scale is roughly equivalent to a year's worth of learning. Now, our colleagues at the National Center for Education Statistics hate it when I say that because they point out that learning is not a strictly linear process, that some students learn faster than others, and so they find ways to quibble with that comparison. But we need to give people some way in order to make sense of the numbers in which these test results are displayed. So what does that mean? If we think about roughly 10 points as roughly a grade equivalent, what you see is that contrary to widespread understanding of American education, students have made considerable progress towards higher levels of knowledge and skill over time. The main NAEP tests have been given for about 3 decades now, back to 1990. And you see that here in grade 4 math, students have improved the equivalent of 2.5 or 3 grade equivalents over that period of time. At least that was the case as of 2019. And then we can zero into what happened in the wake of the pandemic. You see that there was a drop of 5 points, unprecedented in the history of the NAEP testing program, and equivalent to about half a year's worth of learning. And then you see between 2022 and 2024, you had a modest improvement of 1 point, making about a 20% of that decline. And that's the good news, I should say. If we look at grade 8 mathematics, you see that there was an even larger decline, about 3/4 of a grade equivalent, and no evidence of improvement between 2022 and 2024. So the first lesson from the NAEP data is that we still haven't recovered from learning loss associated with the pandemic. And that is the case not just overall as a nation, but across the 50 states, all of which participate separately in the program. So in all 50 states, in at least one of the grades and subjects assessed by the NAEP program, performance is lower in 2024 than it was in 2019. So that includes states like Florida that were more aggressive in reopening their schools for in-person instruction, and states like California, which were much slower. The impact and the persistent learning loss in the wake of the pandemic is a pervasive phenomenon. So we still haven't recovered from the pandemic. We might ask, why has recovery been so hard? That's what I'm asked a lot. And I think the very fact that I'm asked this question a lot points to the fact that people may not be thinking about learning loss and recovery from a disruption to education in exactly the right way. Now, when my fitness routine is interrupted by an injury or a busy stretch at work, I notice that my conditioning rapidly deteriorates. And my first workout or two, when I drag myself back to the gym, are a bit of a drag. But if I push through that initial resistance, I notice that pretty quickly I'm back to my pre-disruption baseline, at least my 48-year-old pre-disruption baseline. And my recovery has occurred as a natural process without much additional investment. I think that's the type of metaphor that people have in mind when they think about the challenge we're presented as a result of the COVID pandemic. I think a better metaphor actually comes from saving for retirement. If a household emergency requires me to skip one of my planned deposits into my retirement account, that gap in my savings relative to what I projected is going to persist until I find a way to make up the missed payment. In fact, I better find a way to make it up with interest, right? And that's the type of process that needs to occur if students are going to fully recover from their losses. If we just get kids back into classrooms learning in person under pre-pandemic conditions, there's nothing in the science of learning and development that tells us that they should catch up over time. Rather, we need to give them additional opportunities to learn to make up for the instructional time that they lost. And that would be the case even if learning conditions after the pandemic were the same as they were pre-pandemic, but they're not. And the most obvious way in which that's the case is that the rate of chronic absenteeism, that is the share of US students who miss 10% or more of the academic year, has more than doubled from roughly 14% in 2019 to 25% in 2022. And that number has been very stubborn in coming down. I worry that we may have sent a signal during the pandemic that school attendance is less important than perhaps it actually is. A third challenge towards learning recovery has been that we've talked a lot about inflation in recent years. Well, grade inflation in public education is no exception. In fact, while student learning has declined in recent years, the grades students are receiving, and therefore the signals parents are receiving about their child's preparation, are higher than ever. It's not the case that from a policy perspective we ignored learning loss altogether. The federal government invested about $180 billion over the past 2 years in supporting schools in COVID recovery efforts, but those dollars were very poorly targeted, and only 20% of them school districts were required to use to support learning recovery efforts. And then finally, as a general matter, I think public awareness of the problem and pressure on policymakers to address it has been lacking amid a understandable post-pandemic desire to get back to normal. So lesson number one, we still haven't recovered from the pandemic. Lesson number two, much more quickly, is that it's not just the pandemic that is the root of our problems. Here I've switched from math in grade 4 and grade 8 to reading, starting here in grade 4. And what you'll see is that if I didn't tell you, or you didn't know, when a disruption to children's learning from an external factor occurred, you wouldn't be able to place that disruption visually in the 2019 to 2022 era. Rather, what you see is that the decline in students' reading performance in the US starts around 2015 in grade 4, around 2013 in grade 8. And rather than there being any evidence of recovery from pandemic learning loss between 22 and 24, rather we see continued decline. So reading knowledge and skills are trending in the wrong direction, and that's been the case since well before the pandemic for nearly a decade now. And I think it's useful as we think about this to remind ourselves that assessments like the NAEP, yes, they capture what schools contribute to student learning, but they also capture what's happening outside of schools as well. And as we think about potential explanations for what we're seeing, we need to keep that in mind. Here's data from surveys the NAEP program administers, asking students, these are 13-year-olds, how often they read for fun on their own time. And what you see is that in just the past decade, from 2012 to 2023, you see that the share who say that they read for fun on their own almost every day has been cut in half, from 27% to 14%. At the other extreme, the share who say that they never or hardly ever has increased by more than 50%, from 22% to 31%. So I think we need to acknowledge the extent to which schools may be facing an uphill battle when it comes to the environment for the development of reading skills in the era of what's been called the screen-based childhood and the rise of social media. Lesson number 3 from the nation's report card is that inequality in student achievement between high-achieving and low-achieving students is growing. Here's data you've already seen on the math skills of 8th graders over the past 15 years or so, just displayed in a different manner. And what you see is that it's been pretty much stagnation, and then you see the setback associated with the pandemic in 2022 and 2024. But look down at what's happening to students who are performing at the 10th percentile of the distribution of achievement. You see that they've been trending steadily downward and then experienced even larger losses in the pandemic era. What about at the other extreme of the distribution, students at the 75th or the 90th percentile? Well, they've been holding their own or even increasing their achievement over time. So what we've seen over the past decade in both math and in reading is a fanning out of achievement between high achieving and low achieving students. And as a result of that, there's been a sharp increase in the share of US students overall who are failing to reach what the NAEP program defines as even a basic level of competency in literacy and numeracy. The goal, of course, is for all students to reach proficiency. That's a good benchmark of whether they're on track to enter college ready for college level work without remediation. But we have growing shares of students who are failing even to meet a much more basic and modest objective. And that's a result of growing inequality. A fourth lesson from the National Assessment of Educational Progress is that geography matters, that the level of student knowledge and skills varies widely from one place to the next in the US in a way that reflects the decentralization of decision-making in American education and the role of state policy. The deepest blue regions in this figure here are counties where the average student is about 3.5 to 4 grade levels below the national average. The deepest green are counties where the opposite is true, 3 to 4 grade levels ahead of average. And of course, a lot of this variation geographically reflects variation in students' family circumstances. Here you see the relationship between students' test scores at the school district level and the socioeconomic status of the families they serve. And you see that there's a powerful correlation where the opportunity available to students reflects their family circumstances. The final lesson that I want to share with you is an attempt to end on a more encouraging note. I realize that the first 4 lessons I've shared have been quite sobering. And so the 5th lesson is that progress is possible. I started the presentation by noting the fact that between 1990 and around 2010, in both math and reading, at both grades 4 and grades 8, the tests and subjects most frequently administered by the NAEP program, we saw in the aggregate quite dramatic progress towards improving student learning. This was also a period when the overall improvements were driven by larger gains among low-achieving students than were made at the top of the achievement distribution. Well, what was going on during that period? Well, this was a period where first at the state level and then at the federal level, we had a strong bipartisan commitment to an approach to reform characterized by strong academic standards and a system of test-based accountability in order to ensure that those standards were being met. And so as we think about the right ways to help students improve going forward, there's a tendency in the field of education to rush out and look for the shiny new idea. This is a part of the presentation where you might hear me traditionally turn to the potential of AI to automate tutoring for all students or other exciting innovations. While I hope that those innovations are productive, I hope at the same time we realize that sometimes in a way that we learned about paleontology today, we can learn more about the future from studying what's been successful in the past. So 5 lessons. We still haven't recovered from pandemic learning loss. It's not just the pandemic we're trying to recover from. Inequality has been growing. Geography matters in understanding the opportunities afforded to American students, and progress is possible. And hopefully, I've made a case implicitly that programs like the National Assessment of Educational Progress are essential to monitoring our success as a nation. The U.S. Department of Education has been in the headlines in recent weeks for interesting reasons. I don't particularly care whether programs from NAEP are housed within a cabinet-level agency or not, but I think they, over time, have demonstrated their value to us as a nation. So thank you for your attention, thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to the conversations.